Well, I'm very pleased to be part of this workshop, and what I'm going to try and present is a sort of introduction, first of all, to say something about what we mean by metacognition, and secondly, why it might be relevant to social interactions, and why it's extremely interesting. And metacognition is typically described as cognition about cognition or thinking about thinking, and was originally, the term was coined, as far as I understand it, by Flavel in 1979, who talked about knowledge about cognition and control of cognition. And this is a quote from him. It strikes me that I should double check. This is an example of metacognition in action. It strikes me that I should double check C before accepting it as a fact. And he was typically talking about things like remembering. Is my memory correct? How can I improve the way I remember things? And I think what's critical is he talks about knowledge. This is a very high level type of cognitive process he's talking about. And it was refined somewhat by Nelson and Narrans, who made this distinction between the object level and the meta level. And also the important point that metacognition involves monitoring to see what your cognitive processes are doing, and then control to do something about it, particularly when things go wrong. And again, it's interesting use of words. It is a system that monitors itself, even imperfectly, may use its own introspections as input to alter the system's behaviour. So his monitoring he's describing in terms of introspection, which again seems to put it at a higher level of consciousness, and also in a sense something you deliberately do. You decide to monitor your cognitive processes and think about them. And I think this carries over into this more computational account.
Sorry.
That was monitoring and control. From Tim Challis, where he has his famous supervisory attention system, is monitoring and controlling this low level, which I suppose we should now call it object level, which has all these automatic processes going on which mutually inhibit each other, which he called contention scheduling. They operate by mutual inhibition, so the strongest one wins. But when something goes wrong down here, the supervisory attentional system comes into play. And one of the critical things about this paper, it was one of the first to actually come up with a sort of computational account of consciousness, because the meta level he considered to be what consciousness was, and the object level was the unconscious processes that are monitored. And I've been looking at this diagram for something like 25 years, and I only realised yesterday that there's actually a missing arrow, which is that one. Because there have to be signals coming up from the object level part of the system for the supervisory attentional system to monitor. So, putting it in more computational terms, you could say cognitive processes that monitor and control other cognitive processes. And this is due to Nick Shea. What are they monitoring? They're control processes that use representations of properties of cognitive processes, which he would call metacognitive representations. So you have to represent the properties of the lower level control system that is being monitored. So what sort of properties are available for monitoring at the meta level? Well, the obvious one is unexpected errors, whereas we know after you make an error you tend to slow down, so there's the monitoring to note the error has occurred, and the control to do something about it, which of course goes right back to Pat Rabbitt's work in the 1960s. Perceptual fluency is a very interesting one. We are aware of how quickly we perceive or recognise a picture, and it's now quite well established that this feeling of perceptual fluency determines whether you think you like the picture or not. The more fluently you perceive it, the more you are likely to like it. And then there's action selection fluency, which is the same thing in the action system. When you perform an action, there's a feeling of how fluently you're able to come up with the appropriate action to perform, and this actually determines your sense of being in control. The more fluently your actions feel to be selected, the more you feel in control of what you're doing. So in a sense, the lack of action, selection, fluency is a signal that something is wrong and you should do something about it. So these are examples of the kinds of signals that might be available at a meta level. But of course, there are low-level properties of cognitive processes that are also taken into account to determine behaviour. So, for example, Nick Shea thinks that prediction errors, which are critical in the sort of Bayesian account of how the brain works, are metacognitive, and they, of course, go right down in the system for learning and reward and so on. And then, even more specifically, there's the precision of the signal, how you not only know the absolute value of the signal you're responding to, but you know something about its precision, which is the opposite of extended deviation, how variable it is. This is clearly a property of the system and therefore should count as a metacognitive representation. But what I want to point out now is, are these, first of all, this is a demonstration of how the precisions of signals are used in practice. So this is an experiment by Ernst and Banks, where you have to judge the width of this bar, and you can see the bar and you can feel the bar like this, and both these bits of information can be taken into account to decide what the width of the bar is. And in the normal circumstances, which is down here, it's completely dominated by vision. The feeling doesn't have much impact. But you can decrease the precision of the visual signal by adding noise, because it's all actually on the computer screen. And as you increase the noise in the visual signal, touch has a bigger and bigger role. So at this extreme here, where this is how you would perform if you just had the visual signal, you're actually using touch alone to come up with the width of the bar. This is the threshold for using touch alone. So here, when you combine both signals, it's touch that's control. But at this point here, you can actually do better using touch and vision together, which is this one, than you can, you're doing better with touch and vision together than you would be with either vision or touch on their own. And this is achieved in a proper Bayesian manner by weighting the two signals on the basis of their precision. So you give bigger weight to the signal of bigger precision. And this would seem to be an example of a metacognitive property, but I doubt that this is happening at the level of knowledge that Flavel was talking about. And so I'm suggesting that there are low-level properties of cognitive processes that are taken account to determine behaviour. So this is metacognition in action. And I will now show you one experiment suggesting that the monitoring of these properties can occur automatically and without awareness. So this is one of my favourite experiments. Please ignore this. Again, somebody is monitoring my computer. So this is the experiment by Logan and Crump, where they were testing highly skilled typists. And there were several experiments, but this one, as far as I remember, they hear a word and then they type it as quickly as possible and it appears on the screen. And obviously they sometimes make errors, and you're measuring their inter-key tap interval as they type the word. And the interesting part of the experiment is that using an idea taken from Descartes, the experimenters act as evil demons who interfere with what is going on. So there are two ways they can interfere. They can introduce an error that the typist didn't make. So they type the correct key, but the wrong letter appears on the screen. And even more cleverly, they can correct errors that the typist did make. So the typist types the wrong letter, but the correct letter appears on the screen. So you have four conditions there. You have where they type correctly, where they make an error, where an error is inserted, and where an error is corrected. And what they're measuring here is the post-error slowing, which I hinted at briefly before. After you make an error, the next inter-keystroke interval will be longer. You slow it down in order to avoid making future errors. And what you can see in this graph here is that they slow down. This is where the error occurs. Immediately after, they slow down, but they only slow down if they make an error, whether or not it's been corrected by the evil psychologists. So they still slow down if the error they made has been corrected. They do not slow down if an error is inserted, if they did not make an error but one is inserted. So at this point, the post-error slowing seems to be entirely determined by what they actually did. However, if you ask them after each word, did you make an error or not, you get a very different picture. Obviously, if they didn't make an error, they say they were correct. And if they made an error, they say they made an error. But these are the interesting bits here. If the error was corrected, they say that they didn't make an error. Mm-hmm. If the error was inserted, they say they did make an error. So at this conscious level, they are fooled by what the experimenter is doing, and they seem to be determined by what they see on the screen and not what they actually did. But at this automatic, probably unconscious level, they are only correcting the errors they actually made. So it seems to me here we have evidence of two different kinds of metacognition, a low-level one which is determined entirely by their behaviour, and a high-level one which is determined also by what they see is actually happening on the screen. So and there are other cases like this, but that seems to me important for saying there's a sort of implicit form of metacognition, metacognitive control, and an explicit form, and they're not the same. And in fact, the explicit form is often misled. So, as everybody knows, the brain is a hierarchical Bayesian control system. And in this case, then, representations of properties of cognitive processes are found even at the lowest levels of the system, because you have prediction errors all the way up, and precision has a key role all the way up. So the explicit metacognition is just the tip of this Bayesian iceberg. So having dealt with that point, I now want to get on to why is metacognition relevant to the study of social interactions. So we're not so much talking about thinking about my thinking, but thinking about your thinking. And this, I hope, will look like an extreme digression. So one of the problems in real life is how do we learn about the state of the world? We arrive in the world in considerable ignorance, and we need to learn about it as quickly as possible. And since it's very complex and unstable, this need to learn about the world never ceases. And of course we can explore the world by ourselves, we can learn by trial and error, but we can also get help from others. And in fact, this seems to be observed throughout all animal kingdom. So all animals learn about the world by observing others. Foraging for food, sticklebacks, starlings, and people will tend to go to the places where there are lots of other people, because that's likely to be where the food is. Lots of creatures do gaze following, including goats and ravens, as well as primates. Imitating actions, we follow the actions that other creatures do, and that's observed in mongooses, meerkats, and primates, among others. Fear conditioning. Infant monkeys are not afraid of snakes until they see their mother monkey being afraid of a snake, and then they very quickly get to learn this fear, and the same has been demonstrated in the lab in humans. And mate selection, even fruit flies, naive female fruit flies, choose the mates that they see the sophisticated female fruit flies choosing. So learning by observation is, I say, sort of seems to be ubiquitous. And there's a good reason why it's ubiquitous. This is from Kevin Leyland's lab, where they had a computer tournament where people put in machines that learned in various ways, and some of them learned directly by trial and error, some of them learned by observing the other machines, and some were intermediate. And the results are very clear. The score you get, the success you have in the environment is greatest in those algorithms that learn mostly by observing others. And this is just showing that you're actually making learning moves yourself is not a good way of learning about the world. So the ones that observe others rather than by trial and error are remarkably successful. And of course, when you observe others, you're not only observing what they do, in a sense they have filtered out for you the best strategies for dealing with this environment. So learning from observing others is a very useful thing to be able to do. But when we learn from others, who should we learn from? Now, just to take a good example, human infants are at the very bottom of this learning curve. They have a great deal to learn, and they do indeed learn from others. They often rely on just one signal, which would be usually their mother or their carer. This is social referencing. When the child sees a novel object, looks at the mother. If the mother smiles, the child approaches the novel object. If the mother frowns, they don't approach the novel object. And in fact, they rely on others more than on their own experience. So these are experiments which show that even though the infant knows that such and such is the case, they still accept the evidence from somebody else who says it isn't. But nevertheless, they do take account of who they are learning from, and they would ignore or at least downweight information from informants who they've learned are inaccurate, incompetent and unreliable. And I haven't gone into details, but if you look at these experiments, you can see what that means. So if the adult uses the wrong points to the car and says this is a duck, then the child will not take much notice of that adult afterwards. So how do you know that someone is inaccurate, incompetent and unreliable? We need signals about the properties of their cognition. So already, this is where the metacognition comes in. How do we know that people are reliable and competent? This depends on some metacognitive knowledge about these people. How do we decide if an informant is competent? Well, confidence, I suggest, can be a marker of competence. So someone who is more confident is likely, but not necessarily, going to be also more competent. And one of the markers is the speed with which a decision is made. So if you make a decision quickly, that's a marker of competence and a sign of confidence. It must be true because Bob Audley, who used to be head of psychology in UCL, said so. And we can see this, for example, in homing pigeons. Homing pigeons fly in small flocks or even pairs, and there's nice research showing that a pair navigates more efficiently than either of the individuals on their own. So they're getting advantage from working together. The pigeon who makes a choice of direction at each choice point more quickly is obviously the leader, because they move off sooner than the other one. And the more experienced birds typically become the leaders. So this is just an example of confidence, or in this case speed of decision, being a marker of competence in pigeons. In Daniel Wolpert's lab, they've done some interesting and slightly difficult to understand stuff on coordination games. So the simplest coordination game is where you have two people walking down a narrow passage and they have to decide which way to dodge, and they should obviously both dodge left or both dodge right, but these two alternatives are equally plausible, so you actually have a degree of uncertainty here which occasionally arises when you start doing this. And what they show, turning this into a game where you have to pull strings in force fields and so on, is that the pairs do better where one of them makes a decision before the other, because of course this tells the other one what to do. So when a leader emerges in this situation, the joint decision is better and quicker. So that's another example of speed of decision making being a marker of competence and actually useful for joint action. So I can say that already. So solutions achieved when one agent decided more quickly on the direction to take, and typically the more competent navigator decides more quickly and becomes the leader. Now this is a direct experiment from James Kilner's lab looking at the relationship between fast decisions and confidence. So in this experiment they're doing a sort of signal detection theory type task, but the way they signal whether the signal was in the first interval or the second interval, whatever it might be, is by picking up this marble and moving it into the left or right box. And you can film this and see how quickly they make the movement when they indicate their decision. And you can also ask the person who's doing the task, how confident were you? And there's a very high relationship between the confidence they express and the speed of their movement. So if they're not very confident, they move more slowly. You can then show observers videos of these actions so they know nothing whatever about the task, and ask them to rate the confidence of the actor, and again you get quite a nice relationship between the actual confidence of the actor and the confidence inferred by the observer from the speed with which they move. So this is a very simple example of a signal which tells you something about the properties of the cognitive processes of the person you're observing, and can be used as a sign of how competent they are. So when we explore the world of others, greater weight should be given to more competent members. In the absence of prior knowledge, confidence is often a useful marker of competence. Now, in signal detection tasks, you can measure metacognitive accuracy by looking at the relationship between the detection sensitivity and how good they are at saying whether they made the right answer or not. And this is typically high. That is to say, people are quite good at distinguishing situations where they probably gave the right answer from situations where they probably gave the wrong answer. On the other hand, if you ask people in general how competent they are, they're actually not so good. And I think this is actually a bias. So you can be quite good within yourself at knowing when you were right and when you were wrong, but superimposed on this there will be higher level biases, so that some people may be consistently overconfident and some people may be consistently underconfident, even though they're quite accurate within the range. So what I'm trying to say is that one person might say, I have a confidence of 6, which is typically the maximum that I was right, and I have a confidence of 4 when I'm wrong, and this is quite a good distinction. And somebody else might have a confidence of 4 when they're definitely right, and a confidence of 1 when they're definitely wrong. So they're both equally good at distinguishing right and wrong, but one of them has a much higher level of confidence in general. And we have to take this into account. Now, so movement time, I would say, is an implicit signal or sign. Are there any semioticians here? You can tell me which word I should use. That's presumably implicit in the sense that you could probably slow down and pretend that you were not confident, but it would be difficult to speed up to pretend that you were more confident. But typically when people work together, particularly in the experiments we have been doing, they actually report their confidence explicitly. We tell each other how confident we are. And there are several experiments now showing that you can get better performance from a pair if you give more weight to the person on each trial who is expressing more confidence, as long as they're roughly equal in ability. So this has been done in Bahador's experiments where they have direct discussion. Coriat found the same thing where he simply asked people to rate their confidence and then made the joint decision for them, as it were. But there's a problem. How do you calibrate confidence across the group? What happens when an underconfident person is working with an overconfident person? Now it's interesting that in James Kilner's experiment of observing movements, judgments of confidence were made relative to the observer's own movement speed. So observers who move more slowly than the actor rate the decisions of the actor as more confident, so the whole curve goes up. They're equally good at distinguishing the different levels, but they think this actor is generally more confident because they themselves act more slowly. So this is an implicit signal of confidence which could lead to inappropriate high weight being given to the decisions of an incompetent partner if that partner is overconfident and moves fast. Now we know that when people work together, they have to work out ways of communicating confidence to each other and calibrate what they say, and they achieve this to produce by aligning the way they use a confidence scale. So Ricardo and Christian showed that when the discussion is allowed, the partners agree about different words to use for different levels of confidence, which is in a sense calibrating the way they use them. But what Dan Bang has shown is that partners also match their average confidence rating. So if they're asked to give ratings from 1 to 6, typically both partners will have an average rating of 3 or 4 or 5.5 or whatever it may be, which you can see in this diagram here. This is the mean confidence ratings that the two people in the partnership use, and you can see that they lie on the diagonal. So most of them are down here, so that those people, both members of the pair, are being underconfident. we see very little sign of people out here where one is underconfident and one is overconfident. So it looks as if they really are aligning the way they use the confidence scale. And this, as long as they have equal abilities, this is an advantage. But the interesting thing, of course, is that that implies that when we report our confidence, it's malleable. So when I'm working with an overconfident partner, I need to express higher levels of confidence than I would normally do in order to calibrate. In other words, I need to pretend to be more confident than I really am. So as soon as you get into the explicit level, you can start manipulating the way you report confidence. In this situation, this is a good thing. It enables people to work together in an optimal way. But of course, there are other situations where manipulating your report of confidence can be done for personal gain, which I will now illustrate from this experiment that Uri Hertz is now carrying out. And I'm very impressed because Bahador's group found this obscure paper, at least to me, in which the word confidence does not appear ever, and recognise that this is deeply relevant to the sort of work that we are doing. So, how confidently should you express your convictions? And this is about, you have a number of people expressing their confidence in their predictions, and they're giving advice to some important person. And the aim is that I want to be the person who is attended to and whose advice is taken. And in order to achieve this aim of being the person whose advice is taken, you have to manipulate the way you talk about your confidence. So if you stated a high belief in some previously ignored stock going up, and it actually does go up, your influence will show an increase. If your prediction is right and you were highly confident that this was going to happen, and it will be particularly the case if the other advisors express less confidence in the stock going up. So in this case, expressing a high degree of confidence that the stock will go up is good for your status in this group. But if you're wrong, of course, and you stated your belief very strongly, then your reputation will suffer a dramatic fall. So you have to be careful. And the way you should express your confidence depends on your current status. And Uri Hertz has done this nice series of cartoons to illustrate this. So this is Granny Smith, who's looking for a new smartphone, and she has two grandsons for whom she will take advice. And one of them, Max, is her favourite grandson because he's a real doctor and is nice to her cat. And the other one, who's obviously called Moritz, is not her favourite because he once stepped on her flowers and he's the wrong sort of doctor. So what should they do? So Moritz decides he'll make a very confident statement that the Diamond X phone is the best one to buy, because if he's wrong, it won't make any difference because he's still going to be down there in reputation, but if he's right, it may make his reputation go up. Whereas Max, whose high reputation already, has to be very careful not to make a wrong prediction, because that would make, so he's extremely cautious and will only make, will say yes, it might be good, but on the other hand there are all sorts of problems and this other phone might also be quite good too. So this is an example where you manipulate how you report your confidence to try and maintain or improve your status and reputation depending on where you start from. We don't yet know what happened. So to summarize, metacognition and social interaction, you have this, within the self you have the subpersonal object level of cognitive processes. Signals about these cognitive processes are being dealt with all at the subpersonal, which is a new code for unconscious level, but signals about these, at both these levels, go up to the personal conscious level, and it's this personal conscious level where the signals can actually be talked about and discussed with others. So this is where you have your interactions with other people, although of course it's much more complicated than this because I've suggested there are actually implicit signs of confidence that might be coming out here which other people could observe also, and whether they observe them explicitly and implicitly is not a problem. But let's keep it simple for a moment. And so I'm saying that explicit personal metacognition entails a mechanism for communicating to others ideas about states and functioning at the subpersonal level. And it also entails a mechanism through which communication from others can alter the states and functioning at the subpersonal level. And this is a diagram of all this happening from the paper we recently published in Ticks with Dan Bang and Nick Shea and various others, which is, you will notice, this is Janice's diagram again, except we've now added a metacognitive control system within this at the subpersonal level. And these are the personal metacognitive representations which we can communicate to others about. And this says what I already just said. So, the good news is that explicit metacognition enables people to share their experiences and can create group advantages. And the suggestion is that it might drive cumulative culture because, if you read Dan Sperber on this topic, he says the key thing for community culture is the ability for things at the personal level to be made public, which is this bit, and from things from the public level to be made personal, which is this bit here. The bad news, of course, is explicit metacognition can be used deceptively for personal gain. I think this always happens as soon as you have explicit signals and language. Most of the time we tell the truth, but occasionally we are deceptive. And the only interesting point is perhaps it's more difficult to manipulate implicit metacognitive signals like speed, and this goes back to the old idea that body language may be giving us a better idea of what the person is up to than what they actually say. Whether this is true, I don't know, but it's not all bad. Thank you very much.
Yes. Any questions? Comments? Yes.
Thanks, Chris. It was really interesting. So I just wanted to comment on the idea that you couldn't manipulate speed.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that you can manipulate speed in the sense that you can set a speed accuracy trade-off.
Yes.
There's quite a lot of work in perceptual decision making setting these trade-offs. But I find it interesting there that you could try and speed up there, but then you become less accurate.
Yes.
And you might then end up in a paradoxical situation where people believed you were more competent as you became less accurate. And I think that's probably the case, that this is more of just a general comment, but that's probably the case in situations where you can't have access to explicit metacognition. So if we look at politicians, they get a bad reputation if they're vacillating and doing a Gordon Brown and not going to the election and all that kind of stuff. So they kind of get this reputation for being slow, when actually it might be good to be slow.
Yes.
So I think you can change the speed, but maybe you're...
There's this wonderful interchange, supposedly in the olden days, which no one will remember, when they founded the SDP between, well, I've forgotten their names anymore, David Owen and, what was the other chap called? Anyway, David Owen says to him, "I'm more decisive than you are," and he replies, "I'm not so sure about that." But the other one of the things we found when doing that Ticks paper is there's a certain amount of work on what juries and evidence given by witnesses, and an overconfident witness will have much more effect on the jury unless at some point he's shown to be wrong, in which case he gets completely down-weighted, and the overconfidence is in fact detrimental to him.
Lars?
Just a clarification. If the bias that people have in the self-rating of confidence, does that go also for evaluating others' confidence?
I don't know. I mean, I presume it would go both ways, in the sense that if I think faster people are more competent than I am, fast people will think slower people are less competent than they are. So I'd imagine that overconfident people think that other people are less competent than they are, and that's why they should be the leader. And if they are competent, they should be the leader, but if they're not...
So I would like, so you had this short question into saying that learning is, you brought up observation learning to say why metacognition is important for social interaction, but you never really said whether it's metacognition is necessary for learning. Or are you implying that we need?
Well, what I was trying to say, metacognition is important if we want to decide who should we learn, who should we observe.
All right.
Now, according to Nick Shea, learning also involves metacognition because it involves prediction errors, and the prediction error itself is a metacognitive representation. But I had one question which occurred to me, which was, well, two questions. In this precision argument, you say we need to know about the precision of the signal, or how much noise. Now, presumably the noise could be out there, in which case would that be object level? Or it could be noise in our head, and would that be meta level? And most of the time we don't know where the noise comes from.
I'm curious if any research has been done on perception of confidence when there is no binary outcome, whether the person will be proven right or wrong in the short term, but rather maybe in the long term, and maybe the immediate effect is in not will this person be right in this decision that we're going to know the outcome of in the next hour or a few minutes, but rather in raising further questions, so kind of creating nuance in a problem where there wasn't previously.
I think it's a very interesting point. Of course, the reason is that we all love doing elegant and simple experiments where binary outcomes is a jolly good thing. But I mean, to slightly change your suggestion, it would be interesting to know whether if outside, before they did the task, you had done something else along the lines you were saying, where you decide this is a competent person. If you decide someone is competent in some other domain, would this carry over into the signal detection task, for example? Or would it be very specific to the task? I suspect it would initially at least carry over into different tasks, which I think would sort of address one aspect of your question.
I suppose, I mean, one idea is that if someone is an expert, let's say if someone is a scientist and they're an expert in metacognition, but they're not an expert in, something else. Yeah, and then the metacognitive expert goes and makes a prediction in physics or a hypothesis in physics that the research has, there's no immediate knowledge of whether that's going to be true or not. I mean, in quotidian terms, how seriously would he be taken, or rather, how would his confidence be rated? It's a question.
No, I don't know. I mean, I think it seems to me in science, people are much more concerned that you have your expertise. And this is where it's very unfair to psychologists, because psychologists would never consider themselves to be experts on geology or molecular biology, but geologists and molecular biologists are very happy to be experts on psychology.
So I was wondering how your model of metacognition relates to the literature on self-control. So there's, depending on kind of what theoreticians you favor, Roy Baumeister has had this idea of like a limited resource model of whatever thinks that it's more about motivation. But either way, the idea is that we're not always equally capable of letting our metacognitive reflections influence our behavior. How does that relate to your?
No, that's a very interesting point. Obviously, we have some idea of how much top-down control we can exert, and we probably have some, and again, that would be a metacognitive judgment, and it might even involve precision. How likely is it that I can exert top-down control? And one of Baumeister's big ideas is this so-called ego depletion, which is, if you don't know, which is the idea that if you have to sit next to a plate of marshmallows or whatever your favourite food is and not eat them, you have to exert inhibitory control, and this is takes up effort, mental effort, and therefore you'll have less of it available if you then have to do a difficult task. Now there's a very nice experiment from Job, I think, et al., where they had two groups of people. One lot who were told, if you have to exert mental effort, it's like you'll get tired and you'll be more difficult to do a difficult task afterwards. And the other group are told, if you exert lots of mental effort, it'll build you up and you'll be more able to deal with a difficult task afterwards, which is the opposite of the Baumeister theory. And you've got very different results from the group. So the group who were told they would get tired made more errors on a Stroop task, and the group who were told they would get energized made fewer errors on the Stroop task. And I think this is a nice example of somebody else telling you about your cognitive processes and actually manipulating the way they work. So one lot are being told you don't have much top-down control, and the other lot are being told you have lots of top-down control. And this amazingly seems to work. And I think you get similar, there are a number of experiments, although I believe one of them is one of the famous non-replicated experiments, where if you tell people they don't have any free will, they think they have less top-down control, and actually show less post-error slowing, although that, as far as I know, is not one of the non-replicated experiments. So this is a nice example of this metacognition from others in action.